Hey everyone, I'm Gavin,
I'm Ryan.
and this is the S.O.U.N.D Project. Okay, so today we are going to talk about reverberation time.
Yep.
And it's a little different than what we've talked about on previous podcasts because a lot of it has been more studio-based. Reverberation time is a metric that's used more for larger spaces. So we do a lot of studio designs with our business, but also we work in a lot of performance halls and churches and auditoriums and bigger spaces where reverb time is a big issue. And wanted to kind of cover that and talk about some different aspects of that metric and where to apply it and all of that fun stuff.
Yeah.
With reverberation time, the definition of it is simply the time it takes for sound to decay by 60 decibels. And a lot of times when you're taking a measurement in a room, sometimes you don't have 60 decibels of headroom, and I'll show a little bit about how we get around that. But one of the big things to know is that reverberation time is frequency dependent. Okay, so you don't have consistent reverb time at all frequencies. Like sometimes the low end decays a lot longer than the high end, or vice versa even.
Sure.
And so it's important to look at per frequency what's going on with the reverb time. And there's a lot of different ways that you can measure the reverb time. One is an impulse response where you actually pop a balloon or do a hand clap, or I have this thing I do with my tongue. I can go. I didn't want to do it in the microphone, but it's very loud, and it's something that excites the room, and then it stops, and then you can count how many seconds it takes for it to decay. And there's also an interrupted method where this is what we use a lot of times in larger spaces when we do these measurements, is that we fill the room with pink noise, and then we cut it off, and the software is able to measure the reverb time based off of the decay. There's also a 2-port measurement, which is a Fourier transform. Things like the TEF machine, which was very popular for acousticians, would use that method. It's basically, it knows the signal that it's sending out into the room, and so it can measure what it's picking back up and then post-process that to get reverb time.
Sure.
So there's a lot of different ways that you can measure it, and there's software programs out there that will do this for you, as long as you have like an omnidirectional measurement microphone and a good USB preamp coming out of your laptop, and you can get these measurements of reverb time. I will say that we don't use it in recording studio designs because it's really a metric that was defined and developed based on the assumption that there was a diffuse sound field where the sound is able to open up and develop these long wavelengths. In small rooms, you just don't get that.
Sure.
You don't have a diffuse sound field, and so that's why we don't use it as a design criteria for, say, a control room or a live room or something like that. A lot of times it needs to be above about 1,500 cubic feet for it to really kick in to be something that we look at reverb time. But for these auditoriums and church spaces, it's one of the defining metrics that we're always looking at, and making sure that we get that right for the given application.
Sure.
The next thing we're going to look at here on the screen, and if you're listening to this on audio only, you can check this out on YouTube or Spotify, something that has a video platform, because we're going to show some graphics throughout and kind of explain some of these topics. But with reverb time, I wanted to show how we can still get a reverb time measurement even if we don't have 60 decibels of headroom to deal with. And so on this graph here, we've got the left side that shows there's a noise floor there at the bottom. At the bottom of the graph there, right around 30 decibels or so, there's a noise floor. And we're able to get our signal up to about 100 decibels in the room, and then it decays, and we have 60 decibels of headroom before it gets into the noise floor. But then on the right side, the noise floor is actually more at 60 decibels in that room, and in order to get 60 decibels of headroom, like we'd have to crank it up to 120 decibels, and sometimes that's just not feasible or something that we should be doing. So sometimes what we end up doing is just going as loud as we can, and then assuming that the reverb is like a linear decay, we can extrapolate and figure out what it would have been if we had 60 decibels of drop. And so you can kind of extrapolate that out and predict what the reverb time would have been if you can't get the noise floor above, or get your signal 60 dB above the noise floor. So that's important. We also look at the application for the reverb time, because what's good for one room, like let's say if it's a room only for speech applications, is not going to be great for, let's say, orchestral music or an organ.
Sure.
You know, like some of the greatest orchestra halls in the world have a reverb time around 2 to 2.5 seconds at mid frequencies. Sometimes even up to like 2.8, 2.9, like some of the like Vienna and the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam and Boston Symphony Hall. Like all these have a really long reverb time, but if you try to use it just for speech only, it'd be very hard to understand what someone is speaking in a room with a 2.5 second reverb time. Because a lot of time for speech, it might be more around 1 second or 1.5 seconds. And,
Sure.
and so there's a big difference when you try to compare those two reverb times. And that's why it's challenging when we're doing churches where speech is important, but then they have an organ or they have a choir or something else. And unless we're doing some adaptive acoustics where we're changing the room on the fly, you have to kind of find a common middle ground, like somewhere in between where it'll be good for both, maybe not perfect for either.
Sure.
You know? And so that's something that we work through all the time with clients. And this graph that I have shown right now is the reverb time for different applications and what would be ideal for those applications. And the way you read this is the y-axis is reverb time. So it goes from 0 up to 2.8 seconds of reverb. And then on the x-axis is the volume of the room, because the volume of the room dictates how long that reverb time should be for a given application. So if we go up to, let's say, 100,000 cubic feet, and we say that we have a opera house that we're doing, you would take 100,000 cubic feet, travel that line up till you hit that opera house line, and then you move your cursor over to the left, and that's going to hit at around like 1.3 seconds or so. So you can do this for all these different applications. You see house of worship emphasizing choral music, house of worship emphasizing organ music, lecture halls. There's all these different applications, and we try to fit that reverb time to that. Now, we can simulate things all the time and be able to predict how a room's going to perform before and after acoustical treatment, and usually we pick a target from using charts similar to this.
Sure. Is there a standard, or is this chart kind of the standard for each of those types of rooms?
There's a little bit of a standard. I mean, this is one of many charts like this, and so people kind of pick and choose which ones they want to go with. They're usually in the same range as far as the reverb time is concerned. One might be a little bit more dead or live, depending on that person who developed the chart, and it's all a bit subjective, you know, because everybody likes a different amount of reverb in their room, but this is just kind of proven over the years of what people enjoy and how they like to listen to these types of music or speech applications.
Sure.
Yeah. The next thing we're going to look at here is how reverb time. I mentioned how it's not frequency dependent, and so, or I'm sorry, it is frequency dependent, and so every time that you have a reverb time, let's say at 500 hertz of 1.5 seconds, doesn't mean it's going to be 1.5 seconds all the way across, and so sometimes the low frequencies, depending on how a room is built, it might decay longer than the mid frequencies. Like we did a job once for Christ Fellowship Church down in Florida. Is a precast concrete building with concrete floors with thin carpet on it, and then a steel ceiling. And when we did the model of that room at 125 hertz, the reverb time simulated to be about 6.5 seconds, which is insane. I mean, imagine filling up the room with that energy and having to wait a full 6.5 seconds for it to die out. Like that's excessive. And normally it's not that long of a time, but it can get up there, you know, and for that room, we had to do a lot of like kind of bass trapping using barrel diffusers and then thicker treatments, and we were able to get that down to about 1.5 seconds, but it took a lot to do that. And so rooms that have concrete that don't budge with low frequencies, and it's just going to reflect all that energy back into the room, they perform differently than if it was a drywalled room, because drywall does flex and has like a sympathetic vibration that absorbs that energy, and drywall can actually absorb low frequencies pretty well. Sure. And so the materials are going to drive a lot of this. But this chart that we have here on the screen is what's called like the bass ratio. And for rooms that are for musical applications, especially concert halls, you want the low frequency reverb time to slope up a little bit and be a little bit longer in the low frequencies than it would be the mids and the highs, because that gives a bit of a musicality and a warmth to the sound. Sure. And this is all subjective, but it's studies that have been done over the years. And so it's in this chart here at 63 hertz. We're wanting it to be about 132% of the value that it was at 1K. And at 125, it's around 130. And then at 250, it's at around 120. So you want to slightly slope up. Sure. Rather than come down. And that is the reason that these orchestra halls use materials like concrete and granite and like limestone, or just things that are very hard and rigid, because you won't see drywall in there. Any surface that needed to be drywall is usually plaster instead, because plaster doesn't flex like drywall does. And so that's in order to get this bass ratio where we want it to be, to make it a lot more musical in there.
So the fact that this is so specific, do you see it very often where people may just go the artificial route, where they're controlling reverb and delay times through their console opposed to naturally within the room? Yeah,
that happens a lot, especially when you have a wide array of applications for one room.
Sure.
And you're wanting to have it sound good for all of those things. That's where treating the room to be more on the dry side and be a little more dead sounding can be nice, because then if you are miking everything, that's the key, is that you have to be able to mic everything. But if you're doing that, then you can add reverb artificially. And I would say that that's a lot of times a lot cheaper than trying to do it with adaptive acoustics, because there's a lot of things you can do with curtain systems, or even having like a reverb chamber where there's louvers that will open and close and allow that sound to reverberate in that space. Like here in Indianapolis, we've got Clues Hall on Butler University's campus. They have those reverb chambers in there that they can open or close depending on what they're doing.
Sure.
But it gets pricey, and so that's a good question though. So if we look at after bass ratio, we just kind of look at the S.O.U.N.D method. We're going to talk about a few of the equations that we use when we're looking at reverb time. The S.O.U.N.D method was the first one, and Wallace S.O.U.N.D was kind of considered the grandfather of architectural acoustics, and he did a lot of studies at Harvard on acoustics, and just got really curious about why certain rooms sounded better than others, and it really started digging into that, and then started doing research at Riverbank Labs in just outside of Chicago. And that picture that's on the screen right now is him in the reverb chamber at Riverbank, and he's just got his head sticking out of this box because he didn't want his body to add absorption to the room. Right. And that's how he kind of came up with this reverb time equation that we use all the time. Like we still use it today, and it was done kind of barbaric. It just like in a room, he's holding inside of that box a controller that would controls that pipe organ, and he can play notes, and he has a stopwatch, and he clicks it when he can hear it, and then he stops the sound, and then clicks it again when it died out, and that's how we get the S.O.U.N.D equation, which is pretty wild. That's something that is that long ago, and all the equipment that we have today, it's still something that's accurate enough for us acousticians to use. Yeah. The S.O.U.N.D is a unit of absorption that was also named after S.O.U.N.D, and it was part of this method that he came up with. But if we look at the equation, and I won't get too far into the weeds with this, but equations are fun. I'm an engineer by degree, and I like digging into these things. So I'll show a few equations here. The S.O.U.N.D equation is the T60, which would be the reverb time. Sometimes it's written as T60 or RT60. Is equal to 0.049 multiplied by the volume divided by the total area of absorption in the room. Okay, and that .049 is just a constant that he came up with in figuring out all of this and doing his method in determining this equation. That's just the constant that in the equation. And then we have volume, which is something you can figure out in a room. And then the total area of absorption is actually every surface in the room multiplied by its absorption coefficient. The total surface area multiplied by its absorption coefficient, add all those together, and that becomes the surface area of absorption. And it's a pretty simple equation, really. It's like just got a few things that you have to figure out, and you could figure out the reverb time from that.
Sure.
The one thing, it does assume a diffuse sound field and that sound hits surfaces one after another as it travels around the room, which is not exactly how it happens in real life. You know, it's like there's other things that come into play. But it's most accurate with rooms with low absorption. So things that are like really highly reflective, like rooms that you walk in and there's a 2-3 second reverb time. The Sabin equation is really accurate with that. Cool. And it's amazing too, like when we're simulating rooms with the Sabin equation and then we go out and do measurements of it lines up most of the time. If it's a room that the Sabin equation works well in, then it's pretty spot on. It's pretty amazing how it still works. One thing to note here is that since the absorption coefficients are frequency dependent, because everything absorbs a little bit differently depending on the frequency, the equation is also frequency dependent, where you have to figure out, use this equation at each frequency. So you might have an RT60 at 500 hertz using all the absorption coefficients of that material at 500 hertz, but then you got to do it again for 1,000 and again for 2,000. Right. Luckily, there's a lot of great calculators and simulation programs that you can use to do this really quickly, but you could also just figure it out by using this equation every single time.
So were the absorption coefficients, was that around when Sabin was first coming up with this, or did that come later on?
Well, that was him developing that at the same time. That's what happened at Riverbank, like where they would use that reverb time chamber. They put 72 square feet of absorption inside the room, measure it with and without that material in the space, and figure out these absorption coefficients. So he was doing all that stuff in real time, wow. Like it's pretty amazing. So with that, we want to do this when it's mostly reflective surfaces, so that the average absorption coefficients are less than 0.2. Typically, is what you want to use this equation for. And like I said, for the most part, it's still accurate today, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Now there has been some, advances in science and different people kind of taking a look at this equation and seeing if there's ways that they can improve it.
Sure.
One of the things that came out of this is the Norris-Eyring equation. And we honestly don't use this equation all that often because it is for rooms that are heavily absorptive.
Sure.
Okay, and most of the time when someone calls us, it's because there's a reverb problem rather than the room being too dead. Although we're working on one right now where the room is just too dead for the application because it's good for speech, but they want to have a choir and an organ in the space, and so they want us to liven it up. So we will use the Eyring equation most likely for that one. But most of the time, we don't use this just because by nature, people call us when echo is an issue.
Right.
But it is just derived from the Sabin equation. And the difference with this one is that you do have to use absorption coefficients that are less than 1. You'll notice on the bottom of this equation here, which is T60 equals 0.049 V. We recognize that from the Sabin equation. And you divide that whole thing by the total surface area in square feet. That's the ST value. And then you take the natural log of 1 minus the absorption coefficients. And that absorption coefficient there is the total area of absorption divided by the total square footage of the wall surfaces and ceiling surfaces and floor. And the reason we have to use a absorption coefficient below 1 is because you can't take a natural log of a negative number. Right. And so if you put in a number there where it was greater than 1, then you would end up breaking the equation and it wouldn't work anymore. So,
sure.
But the difference with this one is it assumes all those surfaces are impacted simultaneously rather than one after another.
Sure.
And also each reflection being diminished by the average absorption coefficient. And I will say that this one like I said, we don't use it as much as we do other equations, and so we don't have as much experience using it. But when it warrants itself, it is still very accurate, and something that is helpful in those extreme cases.
Sure.
All right, this next one, it gets a little more complicated, but honestly, it's derived from the Eyring equation, except it's called Fitzroy equation.
Yep.
And what this one does is it actually puts emphasis on the distribution of the absorption surfaces. Okay, one of the faults of the S.O.U.N.D equation is that it doesn't matter which surface you put the absorption in or on, you're going to get the same value back.
Sure.
So that would assume that if you put 100% of one wall covered with absorption treatment, that room would sound the same as if you divided that up evenly on all four surfaces of the walls. And that's just not the case. Like, the room is going to sound different. So the Fitzroy equation will it puts emphasis on that distribution of the absorption. So if you do a simulation using the Fitzroy equation and you don't divide your absorption out evenly, you're going to get a different number than if you do.
Sure.
And so it's actually very similar to the Eyring equation. You see that you've got pretty much the same equation multiple times, and you'll notice you'll have the Sx, Sy, and Sz portion of this equation. That's the north-south walls, east-west walls, and floor and ceiling, the X, Y, and Z dimensions. And essentially, the Sx is going to be the total surface area of various planes in the room, divided by St, which is the total surface area, square feet, of all the surfaces in the room. And then you multiply it out like you did before, except Fitzroy equation, where it's really, really helpful is if you're dealing with a room where the absorption is not evenly distributed around the room. Like, let's say there's more absorption on the ceiling or the floor of the room. A good example is, let's say you have a drop tile ceiling, which is fairly absorptive, and then carpeted floor, but then concrete block on all the walls. That's where the Fitzroy equation really helps, because all of that absorption is kind of skewed on the z-axis, the floor and ceiling, and that's going to be a lot different than what the S.O.U.N.D equation is going to come out to be. And a lot of it is a little bit of experimentation and like working with reverb time simulations and calculations and testing data. Often we know, like, I can just look at a room and say, man, this one's definitely going to be Fitzroy. And then we do testing, and yes, the slope of that reverb time graph is going to match Fitzroy better than S.O.U.N.D.
Sure.
And so you just kind of have to play around with it a little bit. But the Fitzroy equation, I think we actually use it probably just as much as we do S.O.U.N.D, because there's a lot of rooms out there where the absorption is skewed and all on one surface. Or anytime you have a bunch of different types of surface materials in a room, that's when Fitzroy end up working out really nicely.
Sure.
All right, so we have to kind of determine like when we should use these equations, because if you use the S.O.U.N.D equation or the Eyring equation in a room where Fitzroy should have been used, you're not going to get accurate numbers, you know, and you're going to think that the room is got a different reverb time than it actually does. So S.O.U.N.D equation, again, to remind you, it's highly reverberant spaces, a lot of reflective surfaces, very little absorptions present, and the absorption is evenly distributed. So it's not just on one surface over another. That's when the S.O.U.N.D equation can be used. The Eyring equation is for really dead rooms, and most of the surfaces have pretty absorptive qualities. So it might be carpeted floor, drop tile ceiling, and then drywall walls with a bunch of acoustical panels on it. Like, that would be an Eyring equation application. Then Fitzroy would be where it's just a variance of a lot of different materials in the room, and it's not evenly distributed.
Sure.
So I'm going to quiz you.
Let's do it.
All right, we're going to quiz you. All right, so here's an example. We got concrete walls, a drop tile ceiling, and a tile floor. Which equation do you think we'd use there?
It'll be Fitzroy.
You're right. You pass, Ryan. All right, so the reason for that is that drop tile ceiling in these churches, a lot of times that ceiling might be 8,000, 10,000 square feet of absorption in the room, but it's only on the ceiling. And it skews things to where if you have a situation like that and you use S.O.U.N.D, you won't get the right numbers. So
Sure.
You think you can go for number 2?
Let's do it.
All right. Number 2, we've got the walls are drywall, the ceiling is steel, and the floor is hardwood.
So it'd be Sabine.
Okay. So you're correct again. 2 for 2. So Sabine, the reason for that is that it's all reflective surfaces and not a lot of absorption present. So, all right. This is kind of easy though. Let's go for the third one. What if I mix it up though and I do Sabine and Fitzroy again? That could happen. You never know.
Let's see.
All right. So the walls are drywall with acoustical panels. Ceiling is drop tile, and the floor is carpet.
That'd be I-ring.
Yes, right. You got it. I wanted to have an example for each of them in there. But the reason for that is that it's a pretty dead sounding room. Like it's mostly absorptive materials, and so I-ring would be the way to go. All right, you pass. Good job, Ryan.
Get to keep my job.
You get to keep your job. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about too when it comes to reverb time is that by lowering the reverb time, like doing things to lower the reverb time in your room and make it better for speech applications or like a live band or something like that, what it can sometimes do is make flutter echo more apparent in your space.
Sure.
If you don't put the treatment in the correct areas. Because before, the reverb time might have been masking this flutter echo that's happening, but once it's controlled, then you can start to pick out flutter echo. And flutter echo is simply, we've all kind of heard it if you clap your hands in a room and you hear like what sounds like a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth. Like that's when you have parallel surfaces that are untreated, and what you're hearing is the delay of the sound hitting that wall, hitting the next wall, hitting the next wall, and you're hearing the delay as it goes past your ears. And the thing is that parallel surfaces are very common for flutter echo, but there's some other situations where you can get flutter echo when it's not just two parallel surfaces together. And we actually experienced this at a church in Florida. We did some on-site testing last month, and there was a situation where it wasn't parallel walls, but it still was causing this really extreme flutter echo that needed to get taken care of. So I'm showing a diagram here that has a lot of different scenarios where flutter echo can be a problem. So two parallel surfaces, the most common one. We build a lot of rectangular boxes, and that is something where you're going to get flutter echo between those. But you can also get it as a curved concave surface opposite a flat surface, okay? Because that concave surface is going to focus the energy to the center point, and then it can bounce back and then focus again, bounce back, focus again, and that can create a flutter type of echo. There's also a flat surface opposite like a peaked ceiling or a peaked wall, where you have, it's similar to the concave analogy, but it's just straight lines rather than a complete curve. You also have an angled semi-concave surfaces, which, like, let's say the ceiling is sloped and it slopes all the way up to the back wall. You can get flutter echo just from this repeating pattern that happens here. Also double angled concave surfaces. So sometimes people will angle their sidewalls, but they'll angle them the same all the way down, and then that can create the flutter echo just like it would have been if it was parallel.
Sure.
Nested circular surfaces, which you don't come into, this doesn't come into play too often in rooms that we do, but you can hear it sometimes in hallway surfaces. Like if the hallway is curved and both of the walls are curved together, you can hear the flutter between them. And then opposing corners, which that was actually the church in Florida. That was the issue, was two opposing corners that were bouncing the sound back and forth like that. Oh. So all these things can become way more apparent if the reverb time gets lowered, because then your brain can just now process that a little bit better.
Sure.
It sticks out. One thing to talk about with reverb time is that sometimes you may not be wanting to lower the reverb time, but you want to control these harsh reflections and flutter echo, and you can do that with diffusion in larger rooms. And it's basically you're just taking out these harsh reflections and the echo without significantly impacting the RT60. And typically the diffusion it's nice to put it in places where it's within the first like 20 to 35 milliseconds or so from the direct sound arriving at your ears. And the reason is that these lateral reflections coming off the side of these auditoriums and churches and performance halls, it's actually kind of helpful for the audience to be able to get the reinforced sound from the speaker system. And if you overabsorb that, then a few things can happen. Like one is if it's a church environment and you want people to sing along with the band, the praise band, or what have you. people tend to like pipe down a little bit if they feel like they're in a really controlled, dry environment because they think that everybody else can hear them. You know, it's like when we sing in the shower, you know, it's something that we feel like we're the best singer in the world if we're singing in the shower because we have all this reverb and echo. Yeah. And then you step out and you like, wow, I'm missing a few notes here and there. You know, so it's something like where if you overabsorb sidewall reflections, people don't seem to participate as much. The other thing is that reflection off of that wall helps reinforce the direct sound and can help speech intelligibility, especially for people in the back of the auditorium. Sure. So overabsorbing those sidewall reflections aren't great. And it's something where if we can diffuse it using diffusers or like a hybrid product that's like perforated facing on top of the absorption, where it doesn't absorb as much high frequency energy and absorbs more low frequency energy, it can bring balance back to the room and help on all fronts when it comes to speech intelligibility and musical quality. Sure. And I would say that a lot of times adding diffusion too around like musicians and people in the choir, it helps them hear each other better, and it can just be a better environment without adjusting that reverb time too much.
So in some of these cases, especially in these like whether it be an auditorium or a sanctuary, like sometimes we have walls that we can't necessarily touch. So do you want to talk about how we kind of overcome that sometimes?
Man, that one's tough because there are some cases where this wall's off limits because there's a mural painted on it, or we just can't do anything on this surface. Like in some churches, there'll be glass on the back wall so that people from the lobby can see in at the same time. And if the glass or that mural, let's say, creates a big enough problem that we have to address it, sometimes we'll do that with like acoustical curtains, like something that they can still have the functionality of those things, but if it's that bad and we need to knock it out, then we can do something not permanent and not adjusting it too much. But we did a church one time where there was this beautiful domed ceiling that was all painted. I mean, it wasn't like Sistine Chapel level, but it was beautiful. It was nice. And they told us at the very beginning, they said, you can do anything you want in here as long as you don't touch the ceiling. And I'm like, unfortunately, the ceiling was the problem. You know, like when we did testing in the room, like it was a domed ceiling, so that concave surface was focusing the sound back down. And I remember showing a waterfall plot, which shows energy over time, and you could see ridges in the waterfall plot at certain frequencies. And when I did the math, that wavelength of those frequencies perfectly divided into the radius of curvature of the dome, and that dome was just extending that sound over time. And so I could show that in a report. We still didn't get the go-ahead to be able to treat the ceiling, but at least the expectation was set that, like, hey, if we don't treat the ceiling, this problem will still exist. Sure. And the more information you can give clients, the better on that front. Yep. Next thing we want to look at is the speech transmission index. So it kind of goes hand in hand with reverb time because it's derived by a lot of different metrics, but one of them being the reverb time of the room. It also looks at the speech level, frequency response. Also, we're doing background noise level, late arriving reflections and echoes. And so all of that gets derived or boiled down to just one number. And it's a number from 0 to 1. That's the scale. 1 would be perfectly intelligible, and 0 would be like Charlie Brown's teacher, just be like a garbled mess of sound. You wouldn't understand anything. And so most rooms, you want to be above a 0.6 for this STI measurement. And I've measured some rooms that be in the 0.2 range, 0.2 to 0.3 range. Wow. Like those are typically like brick walls and a hard floor and a hard ceiling and just really long reverb time. But some spaces, even without acoustical treatment, can be up there in that 0.6 range. But just to get it to that excellent level, you'll see out here on this chart, we've got 0 to 0.3 would be bad, 0.3 to 0.45 is poor, 0.45 to 0.6 is fair, and then 0.6 to 0.75 is good. If we can get in this excellent range, which is 0.75 and above, that's what we shoot for, and so that speech can be heard and understood clearly, unless the client's wish is that speech is good but not perfect, so that the music doesn't suffer, and then we'll shoot for a little bit lower STI because that we don't want the music quality to suffer any.
So with the STI, that's obviously very objective, but then especially in churches, we also sometimes will do the subjective listening tests.
Yeah, that's something I'm doing tomorrow, actually.
Yeah.
We're going to test a church tomorrow in Ohio, and what I'll do is I'll get, there's a list of standardized words. They're all one-syllable words. They're pretty easy to understand, unless you're in a bad acoustical environment. And I will give audience members a multiple choice sheet where they circle which word they think I say through the sound system. And typically we're doing 50 words, and we do that test 3 different times. And I make them move to different seats within the sanctuary so that they're not just sitting in the same spot all the time. Because that's one thing, is that sometimes people will say, man, I don't think there's any acoustical issues in this church, because they sit every Sunday in the exact same spot, which happens to be right in line with the speakers.
Sure.
And it's good to get people to move, go up in the balcony, do some of those things, because then you can start to really see why there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But the subjective listening test, it's fun because it gets involvement from the church and people on the committee. But then it also tells us a lot of information, because certain words, that if they miss them, I know which frequency ranges it probably corresponds with, and I can look at the testing data, because wherever they're sitting in the auditorium, I then swap their ears with a microphone and do actual testing. And so I'll have data plus like objective data plus subjective data from their test to be able to do our work and figure out what the problem is.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to go through a quick case study on Reverb time here. This is a Tabernacle Church in Troy, Ohio. And this was a space where it's a fellowship hall that they originally built. The architect was the pastor's son, and he did a beautiful job with this space. I mean, it's a really nice looking space. But he admitted that, after he built it, he didn't realize the acoustical ramifications of some of the decisions he was making.
Sure.
And I've gone. His name's Mike Twist, and we've done a few projects with him after the fact, after this job was finished, and because he understands the importance of acoustics and how much it matters. And they built this beautiful space, but then no one would rent it out, because if you were in there with a group of 5 to 10 people, even, like, you'd start to get a headache just because it was so chaotic, and the reverb time was long, and it was harsh reflections coming off the walls. It just wasn't pleasant to be in that space for very long. And so we were brought in. Originally, they had contracted with another acoustical consultant who gave them a report, but they just didn't feel super comfortable with it because their report said that they needed 2,000 square feet of absorption, and it didn't matter where it got placed. And we just talked about how important that is, about where you place acoustical materials within the room. And so fitting 2,000 square feet of absorption material in this room would be difficult on its own, but then to just place it anywhere is not going to give them the best results. So we were brought in as a second opinion, and this was one of those cases, though, that they told us going into it, like, you are not touching the ceiling. Like, do not touch the ceiling. It's this beautiful wood here that I'll show you on this screen. It's a wood ceiling, and they just loved the look of it. And they had the local contractors that did it were super proud of it, as they should be, because it was a really nice looking space. I'll click through a few different photos of the room. But notice it's mostly glass, drywall, stone, and wood. It's a pretty reflective. So which equation would we use?
With it being mostly reflective, it will be Sabine.
Nice job. Nice work. You weren't just zoning out while I was talking, so I appreciate that. So that's a Sabine equation for something like this. And again, they told us the ceiling couldn't be treated, but notice there's not a lot of drywall surfaces available. There's a little bit here and there, but there's a lot of glass and a lot of stone and things like that we had to go around. So one of the things that we looked at, this chart I'm showing right now, is the reverb time of the room. And there's a few different lines on here, and I'm going to explain what they are. The dotted line is our target reverb time, given its application as a fellowship hall, mostly speech, a little bit of music. We came up with a 1.1 second reverb time at 500 hertz as our target. That's what we're trying to hit.
And is that coming from that initial graph that we showed earlier?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And it's two extremes. It's like speech and a little bit of music. We're trying to err more on the side of speech in that case. And so we do that quite often, to where if for music it's 2 seconds that's desired, but for speech it's 1 second, and they tell us speech is the most important thing to us, we might go 1.2 because it's aired more on the side of speech than it would be for music. So dotted line is the target, and the solid black lines that you see are the acceptable limits when we're shooting for that dotted line. Okay, so as long as we fall somewhere within those 2 solid black lines, then we're doing pretty good. Okay, and then on this graph, the green line would be the computer model that we created of the room without treatment in there. Okay, so notice how it's a drywalled room with a bunch of windows and things like that. And so notice the reverb time at 125 hertz is not too bad because those materials absorb and flex at those frequencies and help to absorb it. And in fact, when I see a reverb time graph, I can almost tell you what the surface materials are before you tell me because I've seen so many of these and some of them have a distinct shape depending on what kind of materials are used.
Sure.
But this is a drywalled room with a lot of windows. Low frequency is not a problem, but you get up to 500 hertz and it's around 2.1 seconds. And then if you go to 1,000 hertz, it ends up being about 2.75 seconds. Yeah. That's chaotic, right? Imagine someone saying something to you and then 2.5 seconds later is when it dies out. Well, by then they're saying something else to you, and it just keeps compounding. So that was the model we created, the green line. The blue line is actually our measurements. I went there, I took a test loudspeaker, and I took measurements inside the room. And notice how well it follows the slope of that green acoustical model that we did. Especially at 125, 250, and a 500 hertz, it's almost spot on. Yep. Now at 1,000 and 2,000, it gets a little off, and I attribute that to the fact that they had some kind of area rugs and some furniture in there that I don't have actual acoustical data for. Right. And so I'm trying to make my best guess, and so I think that's what threw those off a little bit. But then it comes back to being overlaid at 4,000 too. So when you see a result like this, you get excited because you know that your model is going to accurately represent what's going on in the real world. Right. And that means you can start to add acoustical treatment to your model and trust that it's going to work out that way in the real world. Okay. And so here is me making the case for being able to treat the ceiling. The purple line is if we only treated the walls, okay? Right. And there wasn't a lot of surface area, like we said, to be able to treat. And notice how it improves it for sure. I mean, it drops it down to 1.8 or so seconds at 1,000 hertz compared to 2.75. So it almost takes a second off of the reverb time, but it's still quite a bit above what our target is. Right. And so I showed them, like, this is what we can get to if we only treat the walls. And I said, but I have an idea for the ceiling, right? I think that we can treat the ceiling, make it look really nice, but still get the results that we would like to get. So the red line is if they would allow me to treat the ceiling as well. Yep. And notice one of the key parts here is that one thing you don't want to do is over-absorb the high-frequency range. So you see how the red line, it levels off at 1,000 hertz to 4,000 hertz. It's almost the same reverb time all the way across. And some rooms, if you just put too much absorption treatment in the room, especially absorption treatment that is skewed to only absorb higher frequencies and not a lot of mids and lows, then the high frequency reverb time will slope way down and sometimes fall below that solid black line acceptable limit. And what happens in rooms like that is they start to sound like this, where it's really muffled sounding and bass heavy and boomy. And we get all of our intelligibility from consonant sounds, right? Like the C and T and S. You hear high frequencies when you say those letters. And that's where we get our understanding, and the difference between like a word like cat or hat. It's like in the high frequencies is where that difference is discerned. I have actually a good visual example of how important consonant sounds are. And I don't know if you've seen this presentation before.
Not this part of it.
Okay, good. So I put a common saying in there, and I took all the consonants out, right? And all that's left are the vowel sounds. Now, vowels are like A, E, I, O, U. You hear that's lower in tone compared to C, T, S, A, E, U. You know, and so the low frequencies are represented by the vowels. So if I take all the consonants out, can you read that?
Nope.
Okay, I'm going to add the consonants in and take the vowels out. What about now?
Yeah, and yes, now you can,
Yeah.
and God said, let there be light.
Yes. So you can start to read this when the consonant sounds are in. Now, this is just a visual example of it, but
Right.
it works in the real world too, is that if the consonant sounds are controlled but not over-absorbed, then you can get good speech intelligibility. And just showing this on a graph of why this is important, this graph's a little complicated, but it's really cool when you can see it work in real life here, is that this is the relative sound pressure level on the y-axis here, so how loud the sound is. And then the x-axis is time in seconds, okay? And so we're going to look at this first slope here, and we're just talking about the word back. So we say the word back all the time, but we don't really break it down like this all that often. But with back, the BA, the first portion of that's more of a lower frequency sound, right? The ba. Back.
Sure.
But the CK is high frequency, that sound. Well, if the reverb time of both the low frequencies and the high frequencies are both 0.5 seconds, when you're saying the word back, it takes some time to say the word back, right? And so when you say the BA portion of back and it dies out, so this first slope here that's sloping up and it reaches a peak and then it dies out at 0.5 seconds of reverb, then the CK comes in after the fact, and then it dies out. And notice how those the higher frequency portion is outside of the first portion. That means that you're actually going to be able to hear it because the low frequencies didn't mask it and disguise it.
Sure.
But if you change the reverb time to 1.5 seconds in a room like that, notice how the word back goes up, and then this dotted line is how long it takes for it to decay, versus the CK, which goes up and then it dies out in 1.5 seconds, and it's suddenly just masked completely from what that low frequency sound was. So that's the importance of making sure that the low end isn't too boomy and bass heavy, and you want things to decay more naturally together, because it will create a problem where you can't understand words because of it.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to show a little bit of the acoustical data that we took, because this project being in Troy, Ohio, it's only a couple-hour drive from here, and so I had the ability to do testing beforehand and after the acoustical treatment was done. And so this chart here shows the reverb time at 125 hertz up to 4,000 hertz, and pre-treated measurements, is around 1 second at 125, 2.12 at 500 hertz, 2.42 at 1,000. So up over 2 seconds in a big chunk of this mid and high frequency range. The predicted post-treatment results, so this is just based off our computer model of the space, it was 0.86 seconds at 125, 0.99 at 500, 1.05 at 1,000. So it's taken well over a second of reverb time off in our predictions. The cool part was when I went back and did testing at the end, notice how closely these numbers match up. You know, it's like instead of 0.99 like I predicted, it was 0.94. It was instead of 1.05 at 1,000 hertz, it's 1.03. That's such a minor change that I was really excited about how the model was performing well in this space. STI measurements, I took that before and after. Before it was a 0.56, and it was considered fair, and after treatment is a 0.67, which falls into the good range, and so it was much more controlled in there. Looking a little bit at some of the diagrams that we had of the space, we had some ceiling clouds that, again, I did get my way with treating the ceiling. I'll show you how that we were able to do that here in a little bit and still make it look good. But then we picked some spots on the walls where it was natural to put some acoustical panels. So we were able to put some 2-inch thick fabric-covered fiberglass panels in some of these areas on the various wall surfaces. But the bulk of it came on the ceiling. And the way that we are able to do that is by doing clouds like this. And these clouds are actually made out of the exact same type of wood that they had the ceiling made out of, except they're hung down from the ceiling and they're wood slats instead of solid pieces of wood all the way along. And these wood slats, what they do is they help to absorb certain frequencies better. And from doing testing, I could tell that there are certain frequency ranges that were more problematic than others. And there's ways that you can do the math and figure out the the spacing and the depth of the slat, you can adjust those to tune it for different frequencies, so it's better at absorbing those frequencies. And so above these clouds is about, I think it was about 6 inches thick of a cotton absorption material. And then, so some of the sound can go through the slats and get absorbed by the material above, but then the wood slats actually scatter some of the energy back down to the audience without it being a harsh, focused reflection off of that angled ceiling.
Sure.
And so it was just ended up being a beautiful result. You see some of the acoustical panels on the walls. We've got some we had the acoustical panels custom made to match the slope of the ceiling there on the wall. But these ceiling clouds, they actually liked the look of them better when it was finished than it was beforehand, which was pretty amazing.
Nice.
So that really great result. They were very happy. Later hired us to do their sanctuary as well, and just trying to be real creative with what we're doing with the treatment. The last thing I want to talk about, too, is the reverb time simulator that we have on our website. So we talked all about reverb time, but sometimes people don't know what a 2-second reverb time sounds like, or a 4-second reverb time sounds like. And so we created this simulator on our website. And if you're watching this on a device where you can actually scan this QR code with your phone, you can go straight to the reverb time simulator on our website, or you can find it on the acoustical tools menu bar at the very top of our website. But this reverb time simulator allows you to hear speech, a praise band, and a choir in a room with and without treatment. And so you can hear the chaotic reverb before and then what it would sound like once it's controlled. And these are real projects that we've done. There's about 10 or 11 examples on there, and you can hear it firsthand, which was super helpful.
Yeah, it is really cool.
Yeah, we use it all the time where we just send it to people and allow them to, sometimes they'll find a room that's very similar to theirs and be able to hear how much improvement they could potentially see.
Yeah, and that's just it. It really goes back to show just how effective acoustical treatment is when it's placed in the right spots.
That's right. So that's it. That's a lot of information on Reverb Time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Really appreciate you being part of the S.O.U.N.D project. And please like and subscribe and share with friends. It really is nice that we're building this community of people that like to learn about acoustics. And if you have any topics that you would like us to address on future episodes, feel free to email us at info@haverstickdesigns.com, or you can comment below. And we will see you next Monday.